Good afternoon. Thank you very much. That beautiful music was the signal for everybody to sit down again and stop talking. So we can't wait for you all to join us so we can kick off our afternoon's speeches and panels. We've got some fabulous stuff up ahead, and I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to talk to each other. This is an incredible room full of amazingly high-powered people. You're all obviously also responsible adults because nobody has yet jumped on the inflatable submarine or tried to pierce it. So thank you for that. I'm Claire Harvey. I'm the editorial director of The Australian, and I'm also the host of our daily news podcast, The Front. Tomorrow morning you can listen to all the bits of this that you missed while you were talking to your fabulously entertaining next-door neighbour. But really my job here is to kick off the afternoon, which is brought to you by The Australian. Thanks to our friends at The Advertiser for an amazing morning. This afternoon we've got even more fabulous speakers, but to introduce them, I'm going to introduce our Editor-in-Chief, Michelle Gunn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, what a pleasure it is to welcome you all to our afternoon session here at Defending Australia. It's good to see so many friends and to have had so many conversations in the last few hours, and we're going to have many more this afternoon. When I last opened this forum, it was at our dinner down just down the road last year in May 2024. We spoke about and anticipated a period of uncertainty in global affairs, but I don't think any of us anticipated or quite expected the scale and speed of change that would follow in the next 12 months. Today, and we've heard a little bit of this discussed this morning, we gather not just in a world transformed, but in a world undergoing yet another major upheaval. We meet, of course, as the conflict in the Middle East is continuing to escalate. As Jonathan Spire, one of our many great columnists, wrote in the Weekend Australian, Operation Rising Lion has brought to a close a 40-year period in which Israel and Iran were engaged in war by proxy and by means other than direct conventional confrontation. The operation to degrade or destroy Iran's nuclear facilities has, of course, involved strikes on the country's air defence systems, political and military leaders, and oil and gas facilities, leading to real questions over whether we might see regime change. I saw some videos overnight, as some of you may also have done, evidence of some Iranian citizens on the streets bravely calling for an end to a repressive and dangerous government. In the meantime, the Iranian and Israeli civilian death toll and injury toll is continuing to rise. In the last few hours, we've had more deaths in Israel from a barrage of Iranian rocket fire. With 3 reporters on the ground in Israel, I am watching events, as you'd imagine, particularly closely. Our editorial position on this conflict is clear. Israel is not just responding to threats, it is acting to prevent catastrophe. Iran's ambition to become a nuclear power, its support for terrorist proxies, and its alignment with Russia and China place it far outside the norms of responsible international behaviour. The West, we believe, owes a debt to Israel for its fortitude and its resolve. But this conference is also being held amidst a range of other big defence issues and developments. Once again, you've heard discussion of some of them this morning. We meet, of course, in the shadow of what was a startling sight yesterday of US military might on parade through the streets of Washington. to mark the 250th anniversary of the Army and, of course, Trump's own 79th birthday. What an extraordinary display. Trump saluting the brave soldiers who had kept America strong and free, alongside protesters accusing the president of being a would-be king. And of course, within 48 hours, the same president will meet our own Prime Minister at the G7 summit in Canada. I note as an aside that Mr Albanese met with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney just hours ago in Calgary. Security was, of course, on the agenda, and gifts were exchanged, including an akubra and memorabilia from the film Gallipoli, which I didn't realise was named as Mr Carney's favourite movie of all time. He has good taste, and he knows Australia well and has met with many of us in this room, I know, on his earlier trips here. I also note that our report by Jeff Chambers of the meeting includes perhaps a wistful comment from Mr Carney that we Australians, unlike the Canadians, have our own continent. Wistful, envious. Yes, we do. And at times like these, if not always, it feels like a blessing. But back to the summit. The Prime Minister and the President will have many things to discuss, including the US administration's view that we should lift our defence spending to 3.5% of GDP, and the Pentagon's recently announced review of the AUKUS Defence Pact. Both topics are, as the South Australian Premier has just so passionately discussed, front and centre of the conference here this afternoon. And they also feature prominently in our Defence Special Report, which was published this morning, and I think you'll find it on all of your tables. It was expertly edited by Patrick Walters, who's with us in the room, and I would invite all of you to take a deep dive when you get home this evening. In it, you'll find many differing points of view on the challenges confronting us and how to deal with them, framed at a time when the ultimate meaning and strength of the US-Australia alliance is itself being debated. People in this room know better than most that AUKUS is more than a procurement pipeline. It's a strategic commitment to deterrence, to interoperability, and trust. And right now, all three are being tested. In The Australian, we have argued that this moment demands urgency, seriousness, and clear-eyed diplomacy, and that the Albanese government must move quickly to reaffirm and, if necessary, repair our alignment with Washington. We are living in what history may judge as a hinge moment, one where alliances, deterrence, and national resilience are being redefined in real time. It's a time for resolve, and that's precisely why we're here. Defending Australia is not just another event for us. It's part of the Australian's editorial mission to engage the public, the policy-making class, and our readership in a serious national conversation. The phrase, "Welcome to the contest of ideas," which appears on our masthead every day, is more than brand marketing. It communicates what we strive to do, to elevate and earnestly debate the issues that will shape Australia over the next decade: national security, economic resilience, energy strategy, sovereign capability. These are at the top of the queue. Today's program reflects the urgency of those conversations. We'll hear shortly from Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, Richard Marles, who will deliver our keynote address and then join what I'm sure will be a lively conversation with our weekly columnist, the wonderful Chris Uhlmann. we'll hear from thinkers and strategists, including Michael Green. Michael, I see that you've announced Arthur Sinodinos this morning as your new chair of the US Studies Centre at Sydney University. Good appointment. And Olivia Shen and Dennis Richardson and Jennifer Parker, Michael Pezzullo, Joe Hockey, others. They're going to explore the future of ANZUS, Five Eyes, and what a second Trump presidency means for Australia. We'll also dive deep into the future of AUKUS, our domestic capability and the commercial realities of building a more self-reliant Australia, with contributions from leading figures in defence, industry and policy. And of course, we're proud to feature the work of the Australian's own journalists, Claire Harvey, Ben Packham, Cameron Stewart, who is in the US at the minute, but has done a great deal to prepare this afternoon's schedule, and Chris Yeoman. They bring expertise, authority, and a real commitment to fearless, fact-based reporting. I want to thank the advertiser team for their contribution to this morning's program and doing a great job. I'd also like to mention the South Australian Premier. I think he didn't disappoint. He doesn't. I don't think anybody can doubt his passion for AUKUS. And I loved his rallying cry to the other premiers in Australia to get on board. I think he displays positivity and commitment and purpose that he speaks about so eloquently. Finally, thank you to the sponsors and the supporters who make today's event possible. And thank you all, everyone in this room, because you're a part of this conversation that matters. It matters so much to Australia's future. So with that, let's begin. I'm delighted to invite to the stage the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, the Honourable Richard Marles. Please join me in giving him a very, very warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Can I start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. Can I acknowledge the South Australian Premier, Peter Malinauskas. It's great to see you here. Senator Don Farrell, the Minister for Trade, and through Don and Peter, can I acknowledge all my parliamentary colleagues who are here today. Can I acknowledge both the Australian and the Adelaide Advertiser and thank them, and through them Michelle and Gemma, for the contributions you've made in putting on today. It really is an annual event now, which is very important in the national discourse around defence policy. And I know that for a participant in that discourse, it is something which is greatly appreciated. I am very fortunate to have been the Labor spokesperson for defence for 8 of the last 9 years. Stability, continuity in this area of policy, in this portfolio, has been absolutely fundamental. It has afforded us the opportunity to ask foundational questions about what is our strategic landscape, exactly what is our strategic threat, the kind of defence force that we need to build in order to meet it, and the way in which we resource it. It has afforded us the opportunity to gain strategic clarity and to go after it. And since we came to office in 2022, that's exactly what we've been doing. The Defence Strategic Review is the most significant root and branch review of our strategic landscape, of our defence posture, since Paul Gibb did his work back in the mid-80s. Think about that for a moment. Our Defence Force, its strategic settings over that period of time have really been rooted in an analysis that was undertaken at the height of the Cold War, when strategic contest was between America and the Soviet Union, when we faced a nuclear arms race. Today, that great power contest is different. For starters, there are different contestants contesting it in a different part of the world, but there is escalation. China's conventional military build-up is the most significant military build-up that we have seen, conventional military build-up that we have seen since the end of the Second World War, and it shapes the region in which we live. And it means that Australia's geography today is more relevant to great power contests than it has been at any point since the end of the Second World War, arguably at any point in our history. In terms of our own defence capability needs, our risk is not so much the invasion of the continent. We are fortunate that we are an island nation surrounded by oceans, but on the other hand, we are deeply reliant on our sea lines of communication for supply of the country. Almost all of our liquid fuels are imported by sea, but also through export revenues. And so that is our strategic risk. It's the disruption of those sea lines. It's the coercion that could result because of the disruption of such sea routes. It is that and the stability of the region in which we live, because the defence of Australia is intimately connected with the peace and stability of the Pacific, the peace and stability of Southeast Asia, of Northeast Asia, of the Northeast Indian Ocean. All of that is the clarity that comes from the Defence Strategic Review. And the insight of that is that if you look at the geography of our national security, it lies much less along the coastline of the continent as it does further afield. And so when we think about the kind of defence force that we need to meet the strategic moment, it is all about capabilities that project. A much more capable set of northern bases which can send our Air Force further. Much greater cyber capability, a much more capable surface fleet with a new surface combatant coming into operation in this decade. A more mobile, a more amphibious army, longer range missiles, and of course, the Henderson Defence Precinct, the Osborne Naval Shipyard, which in turn will build Australia's future long-range submarine capability that will be the successor to the Collins class. These are the capabilities which we are pursuing. Now, in the 2023 budget and the 2024 budget, we have put in place significant increases to our defence spending, which sees that relative to what we inherited from the coalition, relative to what we actually committed to in 2022, today defence spending over the next 10 years will be $57 billion more than that, more than $10 billion over the forward estimates. And indeed it relates right now. In this financial year, or last financial year, we spent more on defence procurement than we ever have, and we will spend more again in this financial year. Now think about that in a historic context. The last time there was a significant increase in the defence budget dates back to 2016 as a result of the then 2016 Defence White Paper, when there was an additional $30 billion put into the defence budget over a period of 10 years. But within just a few years of that, the coalition took $20 billion out of that away. So there was just $10 billion. That's what we inherited. And if you want to go back prior to that, you've got to go right back to 2007, when the Howard government committed an additional $14 billion over the decade from that period of time. It means that what we have done over the last few years is the single biggest increase in defence spending in peacetime Australia in our history. But as significant as the quantity is, so too is the priority of that spending. Because in the Integrated Investment Program in 2024, we reprioritised $73 billion worth of capabilities. We made really difficult decisions. We had intended to purchase 450 infantry fighting vehicles, most of which would never have been able to leave the continent. But if the invasion of the continent is not the threat, what was the purpose of that? And so we scaled that back to 129, which, if you like, meets our amphibious needs, but in the process liberated tens of billions of dollars which have been invested into projection capabilities. And this is just one example of why the Prime Minister has been so insistent about the idea that the way in which we think about funding defence is through first articulating what our defence needs are, what our capabilities are, and then resourcing that. Now, I understand that there will inevitably be a focus on a number. We benchmark other countries around the world based on their expenditure as a proportion of GDP, and other countries will benchmark us in the same way. But when it comes to our own defence planning, our own defence spending, the only logical way we can do it is to think about what our needs and our capabilities are, and then to go off and resource those needs. That is how other countries do it. Without saying anything about the future, historically, that is how we've done it when we have been preparing for conflict. And to simply think about a number means there is no debate around the quality of that spend, which in turn is so important in terms of the numbers over the last few years has been more important. And actually, I can understand the level of analysis and the debate there has been around the quantity of the defence spend. It critically is important. But just as important is the quality of that spend. And the absence of debate on that, I think, was part of what led to the utterly hopeless announcement that we saw from the coalition during the election campaign. In seeking to chase just a number, what they did was make a $21 billion announcement, and yet at the same time could not answer the most basic question about what any of that money would be spent upon. An announcement of that kind, frankly, left the country short. Now, to be honest, today we do live here in Australia in a more partisan, contested defence debate. And part of that is unashamedly about the fact that we, Labor, seek to contest the idea that some would perceive that the coalition have a brand advantage when it comes to national security and defence. We don't think they've earned it. We don't think that the policies of the past that they have put in place bear any of that out. In fact, we would make the argument that the really significant steps forward in our national security history are decisions that have been taken by Labor governments. Certainly today, we assert Labor as being the natural party of defence. Now, if a more contested environment leads to the coalition being more thoughtful, more analytic, deeper, well then that is a really good outcome. But if what we're left with is the shallow policies that we saw during the election and frankly the rank politics that went with it, then that really does sell the country short. And I think here there is something of a challenge for the new Shadow Minister for Defence, about whether he spends his time learning about the defence portfolio and policy, about whether he takes the time to have the real privilege of seeing our servicemen and women in action, or whether his time is instead spent in breathless press conferences and tabloid press releases. Thoughtfulness will be the test for the Liberals. Now, in our first term, we have all been about strategic clarity, increasing defence resources and reprioritising the defence spend to get a much greater quality and outcome of defence capability. As we look forward to our second term, that process of reprioritisation will continue. In 2023, Jan Mason and Jim Miller undertook the Defence Estate Audit, and they handed that audit to government in December of 2023. It's really a fantastic and impressive piece of work. To be honest, it's given us a much bigger agenda in what has been a much overlooked space than we expected, but that ultimately is a good thing. And we've been working on it since, and as we look forward to this term, putting in place and responding to the estate audit will be a critical priority. Now, we've not released the estate audit yet, and we will respond in due course. But I do want to just quote one paragraph from it. Defence is constrained by the weight of its past when it comes to management of the estate. Today's estate footprint comprises numerous legacy sites without a clear, ongoing link to current or future capabilities. Urgent interventions are needed to correct the unsustainable trajectory that has resulted from decades of deferred decisions on contentious estate issues. This is an example of policy which has been overlooked. And there is the opportunity here to save billions of dollars on the one hand and reprioritise them back into much needed areas of defence, whilst on the other ensuring that we have a defence estate which properly supports a contemporary Australian Defence Force. And today I can announce that the new Assistant Minister for Defence, Peter Khalil, will lead the government's work this term in responding to the Defence Estate audit. As we look forward to the next term, delivery is fundamental to what we must achieve. We need to be delivering a general purpose frigate into the service of our Navy this decade. We need to be delivering the guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise. We need to be delivering on existing project platforms such as the Hunter-class frigates and the infantry fighting vehicles. We need to deliver on the Henderson Defence Precinct, on the Naval Osborne Shipyard, and of course we need to be delivering on building our future nuclear-powered submarine under the banner of AUKUS. But all of this has been a historic challenge for defence. When we came to government, there were 28 different projects running a combined 97 years over time. Now, that did represent a failure of leadership on the part of the former coalition government, but it also says something about the challenge which is in front of us now to ensure that the defence establishment is fit for purpose to achieve this delivery outcome. And so in ensuring that it is fit for purpose, can I say today that everything is on the table, including bureaucratic reform of the Department of Defence, of the Australian Defence Force, and of defence agencies. And of course, during the course of this term, we look forward to the National Defence Strategy next year in 2026. As part of the Defence Strategic Review, what we indicated is that we would now have a process of 2 yearly reviews of our strategic landscape and a 2-year refresh of the Integrated Investment Program. And next year's NDS 26 will be the moment when we again assess the needs of the Australian Defence Force, what capabilities we have to bring into service, and as the Prime Minister has said, to then make the decision to resource it. As we look forward to the next 3 years of this term, what we offer on the part of the Labor government is what we have done over our last 3 years in office. What we offer is thoughtful, analytical, prudent and calm management of defence policy management, which will keep Australia safe. Thank you.
If you want to go to the next one, mate, that's going along there, thanks. Well, Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much for your speech. Can I start by just getting the sense that you have of what the circumstances that we face are? Is China a military threat to Australia?
China has engaged in the biggest conventional military build-up since the end of the Second World War. It's a big thing to say. bigger than at any point during the Cold War. Now, to kind of properly nail that down, I mean, it is also engaging in a nuclear build-up as well, not on the same scale as what we saw during the Cold War, but in conventional terms bigger. And it unquestionably is shaping the region in which we live. It unquestionably is at the heart of the complex strategic circumstances that we face, really. It is shaping more than our region, it is shaping the world. So as we undertook the Defence Strategic Review in the way that I just described, in the way in which we have really tried very carefully and thoughtfully to think about what our strategic challenge represents and the kind of defence force that we need to build, clearly what the Chinese military build-up is a critical part. That's
driving all the spending, isn't it? The Chinese military threat to Australia is what's driving the spending that you're talking about.
Well, it is the fact of a country which is engaging in a military build-up of that scale, but perhaps to add to it, it is doing so without strategic reassurance. So every country has a right to properly invest in its own defences. But what's really important is that you provide strategic reassurance to your neighbours and to the world about what that's about. As we have gone about AUKUS, as we have gone about increasing our own defence spending, the Defence Strategic Review and the like, we invest an enormous amount of diplomatic effort into our immediate region, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, the Northeast Indian Ocean, about what it is that we're trying to do, why we are building up our defence forces in the way that we are. China simply hasn't done that.
Well, they've conducted a live fire exercise off our coast. I would have thought they're sending a pretty loud message as to what they were intending.
It is very much not diplomacy or defence diplomacy, obviously, and I know that's the point that you're making. None of that provides strategic reassurance.
Were they targeting our cities? Were they rehearsing targeting our cities or any facilities onshore in Australia while they were doing that? And you would know the answer to that question, wouldn't you?
Look, I do know the answer to the question. I think it's not helpful, I think, for me in this
The answer is yes, isn't it?
You can now ask and answer the questions.
Yeah.
I don't think it's appropriate or helpful for me in this situation to speculate about it for a range of reasons. Well, and the most significant being, well, what we did with that, with the Chinese task group was to engage in an unprecedented level of surveillance of that task group. So we do know exactly what they were doing and exactly what they were rehearsing. For me to start talking about that obviously reveals our surveillance capabilities, which is why I'm reluctant to do
But I would expect that you would know whether or not they were rehearsing targeting Australian cities or facilities onshore in Australia, and that sends you a very loud message, doesn't it?
Very clear about what they were doing. Perhaps I would say that I don't think there are any capabilities that were put on display there which are a particular surprise. And we were also, as I say, being able to surveil that task group in the manner in which we did also sends an important statement.
The other thing, though, was that we were unable to really keep pace with them because our fuel supply ships were in dry dock, weren't they? So doesn't that, you're talking about projecting power, we can't even project power around our own continent.
Well, we did. Well, we absolutely kept pace with them the whole way. We were there was, as I say, an unprecedented level of surveillance of that task group, both in terms of the naval vessels that tailed them, but also the air assets that we had deployed. And I think the ability for us to do that throughout the entirety of the period in which that task group was in the vicinity of Australia sends a very strong message back.
We have limited time, but to underline this point, one of the things that's important in convincing the Australian people that they need to spend money on defence is that the government tells them what the threat is. But it seems to me, because the Prime Minister was asked this question last week and refused to say whether or not China was a threat. Well, if the Australian people do not perceive a threat, why should they spend money on defence?
Well, actually, I think if you, I certainly agree with the proposition that it is important to convey to the Australian people exactly what our threats are. That's why in the speech that I've just given, there's an analysis which really is born out of the Defence Strategic Review of both our landscape but also the strategic threat that we face, the exact strategic threat that we face, which is unlike an articulation that you've seen from government in decades. So what I absolutely refute is the answer that is the idea that the government's not been doing that. I mean, we have brought to bear a strategic clarity in what we are trying to achieve with our defence force based on what actually is the strategic strategic threat to Australia in a way that we haven't seen
And
governments
as you say,
do in a very long
$57
time.
billion over 10 years, but the vast bulk of that spending comes in the last part of that time period. Your counterpart said to you when you were at the Shangri-La Dialogue that we should be spending 3.5% of GDP. We don't want to get hung up on a figure, but he said that threat from China was imminent. Do you believe that that threat is real and that it is imminent? And if so, why doesn't our defence spending reflect that?
Well, a few things to say, because there's a lot contained in what you in the question you've just asked. As I said in my speech, we have spent more in defence procurement in the last financial year than defence ever has. That's not defence. That's not spending right off in the future. It's here and now. We spent more in the last financial year than we ever have. Not a fact which gets reported that much, but is a fact nevertheless. And we will spend more again this year. So in the here and now, we are spending more. We are increasing our defence spending in what is the most, as I said earlier, the largest peacetime increase in defence spending in Australia's history. Now, all we've said, and might I say all of that, is acknowledged by countries around the world, including the United States. Defence spending doesn't happen in any country overnight, and no country out there is announcing an overnight increase in defence spending. It is something which is built up over time. If you look at what we have done in the last couple of years, it is far more in terms of increasing the trajectory of defence spending that you have seen governments do in decades.
The question will be, is it enough?
But the point then, Chris, is there will be a constant refrain around should we do more? Fair enough to ask the question. Yep. But to ask that question in the absence of acknowledging what has been done, I don't think is fair, nor is it fair to not focus on the prioritisation of defence spending, which doesn't...
And I acknowledge what has been done, and I accept what you are saying. But what I am saying is if that threat is real and if that threat is imminent, then what we are spending does not match the needs.
I think I don't accept that. The strategic threat that we are seeking to meet is to deter any potential adversary that would seek to coerce us. That is our strategic threat. And I am confident that we have the agency in this country and we are on a path to build up our defence force to meet that threat.
But can
I just make this point? When the United States talks in the terms that it did, as Secretary Hegseth did at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, it really is in a different context, in the sense of the prospect of great power contest. Now, in the context of great power contest, what we would bring to bear in terms of our military capability is inevitably going to be marginal relative to
It's not that. It's what you said, though. It is what happens if China takes Taiwan by force. Do we export iron ore anymore? Do we export coal anymore? Do we export gas anymore? Where does our fuel come from? So even if we decided to sit that out, what happens?
Well, if I can just finish where I was at before. A point I made in my main speech is that our continent is more relevant to great power contest now than it's ever been before. That is as much the question in the here and now as is the building up of our defence capability. But we are building up that defence capability. And to meet the questions that you've just put to me then, I do have a sense of confidence that we will have the defence force in place necessary to be able to deter any potential adversary from coercing Australia.
There was one question which came today which was about certainty of industry, and the Premier, Peter Malinowskis, did raise it. And so what he wanted to know was whether or not there was going to be a comprehensive and chronologically organised plan for Osborne so that they would have certainty for industry there. He put that challenge to the Australian government today. Is that a challenge that you accept?
Totally. And obviously we work very closely with Peter's government, and there will absolutely be that certainty. And that certainty is really fundamental in terms of the Osborne Naval Shipyard. It's really important also in Western Australia in terms of the development of the Henderson Defence Precinct. And all of that, I might say, is really important beyond both WA and South Australia. If we are going to build our future nuclear-powered submarines, which we most definitely will, we will need to engage the entire nation's industrial base. That does mean in states like Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, all of those, the industrial bases across those states will also need to be engaged. And so the certainty that must be provided in planning is critically important for them as well.
But one last thing, and thank you very much for your time, and we must make an end of this because we've got to get on with the day. But Prime Minister and Cabinet had an AUKUS division. It has cancelled that AUKUS division. Are you aware of that? Are they doing this in some other way? What's going on there?
Well, I mean, AUKUS, in terms of our defence planning, is more than a division. I mean, it is at the
But it's got to be a whole of government coordination, and that's PM&C.
I think I think that's a fair point to make. We'd need whole of government buy-in. I believe we're getting whole of government buy-in, but all of that is a process that we will look at. But in terms of the architecture of defence, it is utterly central to all of what we're doing, and so it's more than a division. It's not all the effort, but a significant part of the effort of the entire defence architecture.
One final thing, obviously, Israel has attacked Iran. Nuclear weapons on your border. Do you see as it perfectly reasonable for Israel to try and take out that threat?
So we repeat the call that we've made today that, I mean, we are concerned about an escalation of the conflict that is going on now in the Middle East, and we do believe that it's really important that we see a focus and an emphasis on dialogue and diplomacy. But
the Israeli ambassador said words don't stop warheads.
But to be clear, we completely understand the threat that is represented by Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program. That is not just a threat to the Middle East, that is a threat to the peace and stability of the world. At the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore a couple of weeks ago, President Macron spoke very eloquently and forcefully about the threat that Iran's program represents. So we're under no illusions about that. I mean, we say that in a context where we do not want to see, obviously, an escalation of what's going on to some broader conflict, but we're under no illusions about what the Iranian program represents.
Richard Miles, thank you very much. Would you please?
Thank you very much, Acting Prime Minister. We're very grateful for your time. You're a very busy man, of course, and with the Prime Minister being away, he's also the man in charge, so we're very grateful for his time, and thank you, Chris. I'd now like to introduce our third panel for today, discussing ANZUS, Five Eyes, and the geopolitical repercussions of Trump 2.0. Please welcome to the stage, along with Chris, who's going to return, Dr. Michael J. Green, Chief Executive Officer and Professor from the United States Studies Centre, Michael Pezzullo, former Deputy Secretary of Defence and former Secretary of Home Affairs, Olivia Shen, Director of the Strategic Technologies Program at the United States Studies Centre, and Jennifer Parker, an Expert Associate, the National Security College at ANU. And please welcome back Chris Uhlmann.
Well, time is short. I will not waste it, and I encourage you all to speak among yourselves. The more I speak, the less this is a successful panel. But we will kick off. This afternoon we're going to be talking about the alliance, and it's, of course, Five Eyes and the return of Donald Trump as president. So I might begin with you, Michael Green. You've sat in that circumstance in the White House as a National Security Committee member. Once upon a time, we used to see the United States as a constant. Now it is a variable. How are we to take Donald Trump and his treatment of his alliance partners?
Well, it's a bit like what the humorist Mark Twain said after he first heard Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle. And they asked what he thought, and he said, "It's not as bad as it sounds." On the one hand, as you heard from H.R. McMaster's, who was at his side, Donald Trump is the most disruptive president we've had in history. His brand is disruption. I've lost track of the disruption. The NSC staff, for example, where I worked, has been downsized to the smallest number since the Kennedy administration. You can't coordinate strategy that way. He's changed his position on tariffs more than 50 times since Liberation Day, and the list goes on. On the other hand, that's Donald Trump's leadership style. You also have to look at the structure of American interests, the structure of American geography and culture and history. Support for ANZUS in polls we do at our center, the Chicago Council and other polls, is the highest it's been. And when Americans are asked, why do you support ANZUS? The answer is changing now. We find that the main reason Americans say they support ANZUS is because it makes America safer. It's not sort of idealism, it's pragmatic self-defense. In the Congress, where generally Republicans are not trying to obstruct Donald Trump, you are going to see, and if you look, already see Republicans putting in place measures to protect NATO, to protect AUKUS. I know a lot of these members of the Senate who are Republicans. In their election districts, they follow Donald Trump, but their real hero is Ronald Reagan. So I think there's a lot of continuity in the structure of American engagement with allies, but the structure has also changed. As HR said, he dated it to 2000, or I think Peter Malinowski said 2016 with Brexit. Really, the global order changed in around 2014 with Xi Jinping. The U.S. is not going back to the Bretton Woods trade liberalization strategy. Allies do have to do more. Asia is going to have to get more priority. So it's not going to go back to business as usual, but the continuity behind ANZUS, the support for it in the U.S. is quite robust.
Mike Pezzullo, I know that when I hear the word practical, you've thought about the practical defence of the United States and what that means for Australia. So how do you see it?
Chris, ANZUS has been transformed beyond recognition in the last 10 years, but without any declaration or clear enunciation. When I joined the Defence Department in 1987, it was an article of faith, the then Hawke government, but it was really bipartisan, that there was to be never any suggestion or contemplation of US combat projection from Australia. We had complications around the joint facilities. It's an area that I worked in very early in my career. Gough Whitlam very famously got into an exchange with Nixon over the use of the VLF submarine communications facility at Northwest Cape to alert Polaris, as they then were, ballistic boomers in the Indian Ocean in 1973 without advising the Australian government. There was a political debate. James Curran's written the definitive account of this. All of that started to change. In other words, passive support for American combat operations through Pine Gap, Northwest Cape, the facility formerly at Narunga, but now folded into, for some decades, Pine Gap through the Relay ground station. All of that started to change with the breakthrough agreement when, during the Obama administration, the Americans got our agreement to deploy combat forces here, ostensibly, and probably to most Australians their thinking would be for training purposes, and probably initially that was the thinking. But once we went down the path of strengthening runways and building airfields for bomber deployments and bomber support deployments, we've heard this morning about SURF West, Submarine Rotation Force West, which will be 4 submarines coming from 27 onwards, a key part of AUKUS, often, as was demonstrated, I think, clearly this morning, forgotten about. Occasionally other capabilities that are mentioned. In the first Trump administration, Secretary Esper tried to convince us to take either hypersonic or intermediate range ballistic missile deployments into Northern Australia. That was slapped down publicly then by Mr Morrison. You put all of that together and then link it to what the acting Prime Minister, Defence Minister just said. In case you blinked and missed it, Australia is not directly threatened by China in terms of an invasion, the term that he frequently uses, and I would concur. Australia is not militarily threatened by China in the same way that countries that have got historical enmity or territorial disputes, long disputation between them, are threatened. Ukraine, Russia, Iran, Israel. What Australia is threatened about is a US-China war where we are integrated into US combat operations which have not been, in my view, adequately and deeply enough discussed with the Australian people. I'm a supporter of integration with Indo-PACOM and with STRATCOM and with the other arms of the American military. What I'm not a supporter of is a lack of discussion. And I'll leave it with this thought. The Defence Minister just said that they're playing a different league and that for great power contestation, he didn't say conflict, but if it were to come to conflict, our geography, he said, our continent is more important than our defence force. Respectfully, I say the two things are combined. Because if we're getting attacked in the context of a US-China war in our territory, we're not sitting back saying, well, we rented them the space, we don't know what the tenants are doing with the land that we've given them. We need to think much more deeply about this question.
Olivia, when we talk about defence, we quite often concentrate on these sorts of things, and ships and guns and planes and things. But in the area which you work in technology, this war has already begun, hasn't it? The Chinese Communist Party has planted virtual bombs on our critical infrastructure. And in the cyber arena, there is a very warm war going on at the moment.
Yeah, the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that we're actually playing catch-up with something that has already been put in motion. And in fact has a lot of historical foundations to it as well. So a lot of the conversation today has been about AUKUS Pillar 1. My wheelhouse is more sort of in that Pillar 2 space. And the reason that is so important to the partnership is because it's a different sort of cadence of capability. We've heard a lot of good things about how submarines, nuclear-powered submarines, are quite an exquisite capability. Under Pillar 2, you're talking about more rapid integration and acceleration of security critical technologies that are also general purpose technologies. So AI, which is sort of my field in particular, it has a huge amount of potential to create a productivity boon in this country and across all AUKUS partners. The same goes for advanced cyber, right? Advanced cyber isn't just good from a defence point of view. Advanced cyber protects our consumers, protects our businesses, and makes our whole economy a more reliable and attractive place to do business. So I think we need to have a slightly different lens on the different elements that meet what we're trying to achieve in these areas. Now, the Trump administration has signalled quite a recalibration of a lot of their approach to AI in particular. And this is where I kind of come back to supporting Mike's point about differentiation between the signal and the noise. There is a lot of noise in this space, particularly when noise around critical technologies also has a lot of players in private industry contributing to those conversations. But if you pare back and stop thinking about the Twitter war between Elon and Donald Trump or things like that, what we see is a real recalibration of American investment in critical technologies and strategic technologies that are important to us. They're important to us economically and that are important to us geopolitically. So I think I'd really encourage everyone to sort of open the aperture a little bit to what those technologies mean for that geopolitical landscape, because I think we're probably underdone with that element as much as the submarines are really important.
Jennifer, when I was listening to the Chief of Navy this morning and the Defence Minister, I thought they were channeling you, because I have heard you so often now in word and in print talking about that Australia is an island and we need to get our head around that. So how do you see where we stand at the moment?
Yes, well, it was very pleasing to hear and great to hear the Defence Minister reiterating that. Look, I think that, we often talk about the threat to Australia and we get this question, is China a threat to Australia? We need to really change our thinking about what are Australia's vital interests. Australia's vital interests is, yes, its territory, but it is its maritime domain beyond that. And as the Defence Minister mentioned, Australia is not likely to be invaded. That's true. But a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, a conflict over Taiwan or something else, would very quickly be a regional conflict. And Australia's sea lines of communication would very quickly be impeded. And so that is what we need to think about when we think about defence. I just want to touch a little bit, though, on the alliance bit and how it kind of relates to that. Look, I think we often say that Trump is unpredictable and therefore the alliance is unpredictable. I'd offer 2 points on that. I am not a scholar of US political history whatsoever. However, I'd say that if you've looked at Donald Trump, I don't think he's unpredictable. I think he's done the things that he said he was going to do. They're just unpalatable, which is a different beast, right? And so I think that the second element with the alliance is that the alliance is more than just one person. I know we fascinate here in Australia on Donald Trump's tweets or whatever his new social media platform is, but it is more than just one person. And certainly when you see the work with the US military, USS America coming in, you can sense that and you know that. So I think that we need to have confidence in the alliance, but I think that it is our fault that we have divorced too much of the alliance in the last 30 years. And the alliance Australia has always put more into than the US has. When you actually go back to what are they responsible for, we've now kind of assumed that they're responsible for pretty much the defence of Australia, right? We've designed a defence force designed to integrate into their capabilities. I think we need to go back about 3 decades and think about how do we support the alliance, but also how do we have self-reliance within the alliance? What are the missions? what are the capabilities, what are the defence industry that we need to have by ourselves that buffets against some of those changes from any US administration, but also prepares us to be able to defend Australia. And I think that when you think about the maritime domain, going back to your original question, it's very clear to see, and I agree with the Deputy Prime Minister and the government that we should base defence spending on the capabilities we need, not what somebody is telling us, but it's very clear to see that if we act out what the missions are that we need to be able to do by ourselves to support the alliance, we absolutely do not have those capabilities.
All right, given the baseline that you've all set, we've got a mercurial president in charge of the White House, we have an alliance agreement which goes for a very long time, we have the Five Eyes, and we are in a very dangerous era. Can we now talk among ourselves, what would be the first things that you would advise an Australian government to do? If we were starting from here, and anyone can pick up this thread and then just spring off each other. So what would you say?
If I can start, as Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. This circumnavigation of Australia by the Chinese Surface Action Group, including a guided missile cruiser with the ability to do intense harm to facilities all around Australia, was not a one-off diplomatic or military signal to Australia. It was part of an integrated campaign plan the PLA has for the entire region. It occurred just after similar exercises between Guam and Hawaii, in the Yellow Sea, in the South China Sea, and intensely around Taiwan. So the main thing I would say is be clear in your thinking and in your articulation to the Australian people and to President Trump that this is a theater-wide campaign by the PLA and we are in this together. And just to be balanced, then remind President Trump and the American side, don't be so hyper-focused on Taiwan you forget about Southeast Asia and the Pacific, because you can lose on the periphery if you are too myopic. So we each have something we can teach each other.
I'm happy to build on that. If we take it as a theatre-wide challenge, which I think it is, I think it's beyond dispute that it would be very unusual for Australia to be in a bilateral military conflict, frankly, with anyone. When Dib did his work, and we know this from the disclosed cabinet documents that came out 20 years later, in their mind's eye they were talking about a 10-year warning time for a very different Indonesia. So that was the concern in the mid-80s. That's just about dissipated, if not completely extinguished. China doesn't need to exert bilateral military force on Australia to achieve its ends. There are all the things that Olivia touched on that it could do. There's grey zone competition and political warfare that it could undertake short of any kind of military attack. The defence of Australia today is now a fused problem. It's fused with the possibility of Australia being drawn in or actively supporting the United States in a theatre-wide US-China conflict. And then, Chris, you ask what we would advise. I would certainly just advise going back to the DSR work that Angus Houston and Stephen Smith did and fully fund it. It just needs to be fully funded. I'll give you just one example. There's lots that I could talk about. And this goes to the Prime Minister's point about building the force brick by brick up. You don't set a number and then wash the funding down into the capability. You build it brick by brick up. In the 2020 strategic update released by the Morrison government, it's the last time that a 20-year plan has been produced. The integrated investment plan that's been mentioned a couple of times today spans only 10 years. If you go back to 2020, from 2020 to 2040, so we're 5 years into that now extinct plan, because obviously the government was defeated and that plan's been eradicated, upwards of $20 billion was allocated for missile defence interceptors. Not sensors, battle management systems, actual interceptors, be they THAAD or Arrow 3, that has been completely defunded. Now, if it's in an unknown second decade that the current government has tasked Defence to construct without any public notification, great, but that means we don't get those interceptors for another 11 years. Fund missile interceptors, that's one example.
I'm going to go with a longer term kind of wish list, if that's okay. I would look at accelerating technology diffusion in this country. And I know that sounds really broad, but what I mean by that is all of the base foundational things we need, particularly around people, that we need to take advantage of the fantastic strategic technologies that we have available to us now, particularly as a part of our international alliances and relationships. So I love to tell this story, so if you'll forgive me. What was Taiwan known for in the 1980s? Shoes, umbrellas and fruit. What are they known for now? as the leading chip manufacturers in the world and a huge geostrategic boon for allies and partners. How did they get to that point? Well, in the mid-1970s, they actually had a project that was all about having Taiwanese American-educated engineers amplify the technology they had available through their partnerships with the United States. So there's one specific project where they licensed integrated circuit technology from Radio Corporation America. And they bankrolled a Taiwanese technical college to do a pilot project using that technology and just learning how to produce just two aspects of that integrated circuit supply chain. And what did that start? It started the greatest acceleration of industrial capability in Taiwan, so that they are now the leading provider of technology firms. And I know TSMC gets a lot of the airplay, but also companies like UMC, AMD, they are all Taiwanese founded. This was not a coincidence. It was clear-eyed, insightful future forecasting of what this economy could look like. Now, I challenge you to imagine another country of about 25 million very well-educated people who are an island exporting nation and have very privileged access to some of the best technology in the world. What could that look like for us? So those are the kind of foundational things that I think we really need to invest in, and particularly around the STEM. I know there's I think it was Vice Admiral Hammond who talked about STEM and engineering, and I'm very sorry that our young early career engineers are no longer with us. But I really, really want to focus on what that could mean if we could amplify and kickstart an entire generation of very confident, capable, and technology-ready workforce in this country. Because that doesn't give us just the capabilities to win a war, but that economic diffusion of these technologies across our economies, across our industrial base, gives us the economic strength to sustain that war if it should come to that.
This panel feels like speed dating. It's quick. Look,
No, you
So you sound like you used to have experience with it.
Married 3.5 years. No, look, two comments. Look,
Friday night for Jen.
Building on what I was saying before, I think that we've done some great strategy, foundational work, but I think we need to build on that. We really do need to understand what is Australia's role in the event of a conflict, what is the role of the Defence Force, what is the role of the defence industry, how do we think about mobilising, what is our relationship with the alliance. And I think we need to etch that out, we need to have that conversation with the US. I think otherwise we will be caught out when a conflict hopefully doesn't arise, but is increasingly likely, and we are simply at the whim of the US, as opposed to having etched out what we think we are happy to do and what we are capable of doing.
Yeah. Right, well, you're right, it is a bit like speed dating, and I'm afraid this date is coming rapidly to an end. I know, having organised conferences in the past, that the people I hate most are the ones that speak longest on stage, so I'd like to thank you all very much for that. But I would make this point: it seems to me that in a political sense, what it begins with is the political dialogue with the Australian people that tells them what the threat is and why they would need to fund their military to a far greater extent now. And if you don't have that conversation, then nothing will follow thereafter. But anyway, we'll leave it at that. Can you please thank our panel? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speed dating session. Thanks to Michael Green, Michael Pezzullo, Olivia Shen, Jennifer Parker, and of course, Chris Ullman. I'd now like to introduce a Q&A we were able to pre-record with Mike Gallagher, the former US representative. The discussion is moderated by our own Cameron Stewart. He's our chief international correspondent at The Australian. I'd also like to mention this was filmed before the news of the Trump administration's review of AUKUS and, of course, before the Israel-Iran war broke out. So it feels like a million years ago, but in fact is only a few days. So without further ado, this is Mike Gallagher and Cameron Stewart. Thank you.
Mike Gallagher, Distinguished Fellow at the Hudson Institute, former Republican congressman and a very good friend of Australia, being the co-founder of the Friends of Australia caucus on the Hill. Welcome to the Defending Australia conference.
It's an honor to be with you.
The second Trump presidency has been a whirlwind. Australians are wondering what it means for this region. Trump has been a little isolationist in some of his comments in relation to Europe, saying Europe is responsible for their own security. Could that happen here in the Indo-Pacific? What sort of commitment do you think this administration will have to an ongoing strong American presence in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I think an honest reading of the administration's rhetoric, particularly the Secretary of Defense speech at the Shangri-La Dialogues a couple weeks ago, reveals that the administration is committed to the Indo-Pacific. They said explicitly that the Indo-Pacific is the priority region. They're committed to enhancing U.S. military presence as well as working with allies to help them enhance their own military capabilities in the region. So I'm very confident that the administration will prioritize the Indo-Pacific in general and the U.S.-Australian alliance in particular. I was always struck when I was in Congress and indeed still in the private sector as to how much bipartisan support the U.S.-Australian alliance has. I was a huge advocate of and proponent for AUKUS, and I think it was the Biden administration's signature achievement in the region. Now, of course, and I think the Trump administration is committed to continuing AUKUS. Now, of course, there's a lot of work to be done. We struggled in the last few years to break down ITAR barriers, for collaboration, for advanced technology, for AUKUS and nuclear submarine production. We obviously are struggling to build ships on time in America, which directly impacts our AUKUS commitments. But there, I think I am most hopeful, let's say, cautiously optimistic based on the conversations I've had with the administration. I just interviewed the Secretary of the Navy last week when I got back from Singapore, and they are committed to revitalizing American shipbuilding. The Deputy Secretary of Defense wakes up every single day thinking about submarine production. So a lot of work to be done. There's going to be challenges. I would say the trade aspect of the relationship is probably the biggest source of friction. But when it comes to the foundation of our military alliance, I'm very confident that not only will the Trump administration build upon the foundation that exists, but there will be a bipartisan, overwhelming supermajority in Congress that's committed to building and modernizing the alliance as well.
So you don't see the alliance as being less predictable or uncertain as it once was, given the transactional nature of Donald Trump?
The thing I think is most unpredictable is the course of U.S.-China trade negotiations right now. I mean, we saw this in the first Trump administration, right? On the one hand, it was the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, a remarkable turn in a hawkish direction on China. And I do think President Trump deserves credit for what was once an unpopular minority position, then became the foreign policy consensus. But even then, on the other hand, you had more dovish members of the administration, the former Secretary of the Treasury, who were always seeking to do a trade deal with China that culminated in the phase one trade deal, which I think any honest assessment of reveals that China didn't live up to the promises they made on the phase one trade deal. Like every international agreement they've ever made, they've cheated on and haven't lived up to the commitment. So I think there's a bit of the same dichotomy in this administration. And some of that's with Trump himself. On the one hand, he's willing, probably more willing than any president we've had, to push back on China. On the other hand, he does seem to think he can do a deal directly with Xi Jinping. So it's almost like that negotiation and relationship is the most unpredictable element. Obviously, Australia is affected by that. I proudly have my Drink Australian Wine poster in the background, which I got when China imposed essentially a wine embargo on Australia for having the temerity to question COVID origins. And so we understand that you are directly impacted by the course of those negotiations. It's unpredictable. And it's difficult. I think we've learned just how difficult it is to decouple in certain areas from China.
And what about the strategic sides of the relationship between the US and China? How do you think that will play out under the Trump administration? I mean, do you think China senses opportunity here, for example, with Taiwan?
Well, I've long made the argument in the previous administration, in this administration, and even in Trump 1.0, that we have entered the window of maximum danger. That if Xi Jinping is serious about wanting to take Taiwan by force if necessary, and I believe he is serious when he talks to his own audience, a party audience, he talks about not passing this on to the next generation. because of looming demographic issues that will become most acute in the 2030s, I think it makes it more likely that Xi Jinping makes a move within the next 5 years. We also have some big bills that are coming due here in America, right? We're trying to recapitalize not just our nuclear submarine fleet, but our entire nuclear triad. There's been some internal division. So I do think we're in a sort of dangerous deterrence window right now. And the conventional balance of power continues to get worse. As we struggle to put ships in the water, China has built the biggest navy in the world. And I've always been mystified when I say something like this. Usually someone from the business or financial community will say, well, that's crazy. Xi Jinping won't actually try and take Taiwan. He'll get economically crushed if he does that. I think they get the causality precisely backward. Or they'll say because Xi's economy is bad, he won't make a move. The causality there is backward. I think Xi's economy is bad because he's trying to sanction-proof his economy in preparation for the pain that will ensue when he attempts to take Taiwan. So I think we have to take this seriously. I think the risks are becoming more acute. All the more reason why we need to move heaven and earth to enhance deterrence in the near term in concert with our closest ally in the world, i.e. Australia.
Well, let me ask you about the South Pacific. The Trump administration has cut AusAid, and it's probably created a power vacuum, if you like, a soft power vacuum in the South Pacific. I mean, China is rushing to try and fill that vacuum. Is it up to Australia and like-minded countries in the region to try desperately to counter the loss of the US there and fill that vacuum before China can?
Well, it's a huge problem. I grant you that. And beyond the actual number, like dollars that we invest in the South Pacific, I've always thought that there is just a dearth of expertise in our own national security community here in America when it comes to the South Pacific. Put differently, I was part of a generation of military and national security professionals who rushed out to learn Arabic and become Middle East experts. There's something similar happening right now with China, but show me the expert on Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea. These are critical parts of the region and an area where for a modest investment of resources, you can have an outsized impact. And that's indeed what China is showing. And if you think about a confrontation with China over Taiwan, Las Vegas rules don't apply. What happens there will not stay there. All of these South Pacific islands become relevant in what will be a theater-wide confrontation. And so I have been an advocate for enhancing our presence, increasing our presence, as well as investing in the expertise necessary to really make sense of the region. And there, I think we have a lot to learn from Australia. I mean, just by virtue of geographic proximity, you're going to know more about the South Pacific than we ever will. And that's where I think we need to lean on you, where we can bring some resources to bear. You can bring expertise to bear. It's always interesting, too, whenever I go to Australia, which my goal in life is to move to Australia for at least 2 years and bring my family there. I always leave with the message that I receive from multiple people in the ecosystem there. It's like, pay attention to Indonesia, pay attention to PNG. You guys aren't paying enough attention. This is our first island chain. And so that's been received in America, but we still need to invest the time, attention, resources, and human capital to really counter Chinese pernicious influence in the region.
Mike, we're seeing an enmeshed Australia-US alliance in a way that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. We're about to see the rotation of US nuclear submarines through Perth. We're already seeing rotation of Marines in Darwin, US strategic bombers in Northern Australia. With the rising China, is this the future model for the alliance, do you think?
I think it's the beginning of something even more exciting for the alliance, which is sovereign Australian capabilities, leveraging some legacy and new American innovation, but really a true sovereign Aussie capabilities, whether it's operating nuclear submarines on your own or with joint crews, whether it's long-range precision fires freed from the restrictions of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, now that we got out of it in the first Trump administration. You can imagine, INF non-compliant systems armed with advanced energetics in the Northern Territories of Australia. I think it's a very exciting time. And then when you really exploit all of the areas under AUKUS Pillar 2 for collaboration and true technology innovation in both sides in critical areas, whether it's advanced cybersecurity, energetics, quantum, AI. Things get really exciting. And I think all of this should be built upon what we could consider a true joint defense industrial base, or what we called a national technology industrial base. Remember, we incorporated Australia formally into our national technology industrial base in 2018, I believe. But that didn't really mean anything. It's only now that we're seeing that become something real, where we make it easier for people to work, for Aussies to work in American defense manufacturing facilities and vice versa, for us to profit from your technological innovation, vice versa. That's where things get really exciting. And then expanding the aperture to include economic warfare, right? How do we make our joint supply chains more resilient? And there, look at the CCP trying to weaponize their dominance in rare earth mining and processing. Well, speaking of Perth, there's a lot of areas surrounding Perth with rich economic resources when it comes to rare earth, with deep expertise when it comes to mining, where we could really combine forces in an economic domain. And that to me is exciting. And that could be actually the foundation of turning the Quad into something beyond just a diplomatic meeting club, into almost an energy alliance that would scare the crap out of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and the linkage between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, which of course is one of the greatest concerns at the moment. Mike, can I just follow up about AUKUS? There are some concerns in Australia about the issue of trust, in the sense that under the legislation in the US, a president in 2032, when the US is due to sell its first Virginia-class submarine to Australia, can veto the sale if he believes, or she believes, that it will undermine the strength of the US submarine fleet. Now, look, while that might seem unlikely, it is an escape clause that is concerning some people here in Australia. You know Washington well. What do you think? Do you think there's any merit in that concern?
I understand the concern. And as I said before, we are struggling to build enough Virginia class subs. We keep investing money in the problem and we haven't been able to fix it. I will, however, say a few things. If you look at the reconciliation bill that I think is likely to pass the United States Congress here, there is a big investment, not just for status quo shipbuilding, but for next generation AI-enabled shipbuilding. And I think we have an opportunity to really do a complete software upgrade for the entire submarine and maritime industrial base that will allow us to start getting hulls in the water faster prior to 2030, which will alleviate that concern. And the second thing I would say is I do, while of course, like every country, America has to prioritize its own national security interests, I think there's a sense that AUKUS is a no-fail endeavor. And indeed, that it is in our own national security interest to make sure that we are fulfilling our promises under AUKUS. And then an appreciation for the significant investment that Australia has made in our shipbuilding industrial base and your shipbuilding industrial base. And so I think if if reconciliation passes, and we make big but smart investments in how we build ships in general and submarines in particular, the concerns over the escape clause will diminish. And again, I do think, your average member of Congress and the administration is committed to making sure AUKUS is successful going forward.
And perhaps linked to that is the level of defence spending. There's been a big debate here in Australia about how much Australia should be spending on defence at the moment. Australia currently spends about 2% of GDP on defence at a time when the US is asking allies around the world to lift their defence spending. Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, just said last week he wanted to see Australia ideally go to 3.5% of GDP as soon as possible. Donald Trump has asked the Europeans to pay more. I mean, should Australia be paying more for its defence?
Well, I think all countries in the region, or all countries in the beating heart of the free world, need to recognize that we are in the early stages of a new Cold War. And therefore, I think it is sensible for us to be spending at Cold War levels. In America, that actually means getting closer to 4 to 5% of GDP on defense, which seems like an astronomical number, but requires us to make some hard choices in terms of investing in guns versus butter. We're not going bankrupt in America because of defense spending. It's because of legacy entitlement spending. And indeed, the same problem is acutely expressed within the military, right? Where spending on retirement, on healthcare is crowding out the money we need for weapons, for things that actually enhance lethality. And maybe that's where I would concede a little bit to people who are skeptical of the overall number. I would say, if you spent 4% of GDP on defense, but on the wrong things, like things that weren't interoperable with American systems where we can't fight together as allies, then it wouldn't be a good investment. If you spent 2% of GDP and we spent 3% of GDP well, and we really integrated our warfighting functions and had a common operational picture, right, where we fight off the same platform, we have a single pane of glass that unites all our warfighters, then you could maybe spend a smaller amount of money, but still get enhanced deterrence and enhanced lethality. If we're spending money on legacy systems that don't work, if we're wasting tens of billions of dollars on infrastructure that is outdated, well, that's not a good investment. So just as important as the overall amount we spend is how we spend that money. And there's money that goes unspent that Congress appropriates every year for our Defense Department on the order of $10 to $15 billion a year. I was an advocate of taking that money and allowing the Secretary of Defense to make big investments in his own priorities. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is yes, but yes, I do think in light of the threat, which is getting greater, not lessening, Australia, America, Japan should be spending more on their own defense. But, and this is a big but, how that money is spent matters just as, if not more than, the overall top line budget number.
Yeah, exactly. It's a big debate that's going to be had here in Australia and around the world. Mike Gallagher, thank you so much for speaking to us today. We really appreciate it.
It's an honor. I love Australia. I look forward to returning in the near future.
Thank you very much. There's some impressive merch on the tables back there, but there's nothing quite as impressive as that puffer jacket with US Marines embroidered on the corner. We need to get some of those that say the Australian. I would happily wear one of those. Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from our fourth panel for the day. So please welcome to the stage Professor Peter J. Dean, who's the Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, Catherine Richards, AM, CSC, and a whole lot of other acronyms that I don't have time to read out here, Chief Engineer of Engineers Australia, a very eminent woman, Professor Ian Langford, DSc and BARS, PhD. Dennis Richardson, it says here former public servant, but I don't think that quite captures everything that Dennis Richardson has done in his career of service to Australia. And another very eminent person, with not quite so many initials, is Ben Packham, our Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent here at The Australian, to moderate a discussion on AUKUS and the key priorities for Indo-Pacific security. Take it away, Ben.
Thanks, Claire. We might get straight down to it. Dennis, you've seen a lot over the years and your many capacities. How concerned should we be about the US's AUKUS review and the demands that are being made for more defence spending by Australia?
I chair the Canberra Raiders, and if you talk to football coaches about an upcoming important game, they'll tell you that you can spend so much time looking at the opposition and others, but ultimately what you've got to do is focus on what you've got control of yourself. And when it comes to AUKUS and the review, I think it's fairly simple. One, we seek to engage as positively as what we can, and I think that's what we're doing. But secondly, we've got to ensure that our part of the deal is being done as well as we can and as efficiently as we can. So I think it's a question of looking at ourselves rather than being nervous Nellies about what's happening across the Pacific.
Are we doing our best, do you think?
Well, we're certainly doing our best. I think there's been an enormous amount of very good work done in Australia. The Australian Submarine Agency, Defence, the South Australia, West Australian governments, the private sector, all of that is terrific. However, when you strip it down, we essentially have a national enterprise being managed as a defence project, and that won't work. We do have some risks. They lie in political will, governance and budget. There's also some other risks in relation to workforce, etc., which I think will be done. So we have our challenges, but there's no reason why we can't meet those challenges.
Speaking of workforce, Kath Richards, you're the Chief Engineer at Engineers Australia.
Yes, Ben.
Skills is looming as a huge challenge for the AUKUS project. What's your assessment of the skills gap ahead of us?
Well, it is a very big challenge, but I think if I could just take a step back there, you know, when we look at AUKUS, it's fundamentally this, we look at it through the lens of the outcome, yeah, underpinning the global rules-based order. And as Engineers Australia, we don't see the global rules-based order as some abstract geopolitical thing. It's our signature on the Washington Accord, on the Dublin Accord, on the Sydney Accord, and these are the accords loosely gripped up under the UNESCO structure, which enable that, if you like, that free movement of global engineering talent to get after the challenges that our world faces. And we take that global rules-based order and we then translate it down into the very fabric of Australian society by accrediting universities and by credentialing our people, engineers, and in that way, everyday Australians can trust the 500,000 engineers in this country, the 135,000 engineers in our membership, and that's bigger than the entire ADF, to simply get on and look after the technology which keeps a modern Australia running. Now we've got a problem. There aren't enough engineers. So we are calling on 60,000 more engineering graduates over the next 10 years. But more importantly, we need to get after the pipelines to enable people to be engineering ready. That's in our schools. And then we need to get after, if you like, removing the technical cataracts, which so many Australians have, because engineering is ubiquitous in every single sector of Australian life. People don't value it. So now's the time to value engineering and value engineers. That's what we've got to get after.
Ian Langford, you've just been in the US for a series of high-level meetings. What were you hearing about the level of confidence in Washington in Australia's efforts on AUKUS so far?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think, again, subject to the controversies of this week, the concerns coming out of certain parts of the administration are consistent with the announcement of the review to be led by Elridge Colby. I think in the context of AUKUS more broadly, there's an evolution now that it's being seen, I think, more as a logic rather than a method. So by that I mean AUKUS as a design principle, both in terms of the delivery of submarines under Pillar 1, including the transfer in the second phase, but also what the advanced capability field looks like moving into, particularly the relational contest with the PRC. See, one of the elements of the debate that comes out of the US, and also spend time in the UK as well, and I'd offer this as a contrast to some of the discussions here today, is we compare defence spending to years previous and different epochs in our recent military history. But of course, the main game is the relational context and contrast to the pacing threat. And so when you think about Pillar 2, and this is part of the discussion, the advanced capability sets in Pillar 2 should always be seen relative to the threat and not relative to an endeavour where it's science for the sake of itself, and I'm not suggesting that. And so in the UK, for example, when we talk about AUKUS Pillar 2, we do that through the prism of hypersonics, counter-hypersonics, air defence, electronic warfare, and those things that are relative to the current fight in Ukraine right now. When we talk about Pillar 2, particularly in the research side, in US conversations, it's always about closing the missile gap, if you like, in the field of hypersonics as it relates to a potential adversary, or the pacing challenge, which is a bit more of a banal way of describing it. So AUKUS, as a discussion around submarines, focuses specifically on build rates, which we've relitigated obviously as part of the discussion today, and nothing further more needs to be said. AUKUS Pillar 1, in my view, in this country, is a term that seeks to solve every military problem, which clearly it does not. So it fixes the submarine pathway to SSN AUKUS in terms of its design and execution. It doesn't solve the fight tonight capability gap from now through to the end of this decade, which, when you put a relational context to the pacing threat on it, is a different problem set altogether. One of the discussions I have with US colleagues in universities and across government is 90 to 95% of what is in the inventory today, right now, is what you've got in 2027. So that focuses the mind in terms of what preparedness looks like, what readiness looks like. And I'm not pro-war, I'm not beating drums, I'm not talking about this as an inevitable outcome. But in the context of deterrence, which is an effect that we're trying to create under current policy and that we're doing well in some respects but not in others, the Pillar 1 conversation is largely irrelevant to the problem of now relative to the pacing threat. And so when you talk AUKUS in the UK and in the US, I think it's more about a logic in terms of cooperation, alliance management, fight tonight capabilities, less so than the pathway to a conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarine for Australia.
Peter Dean, do you see any progress at all on AUKUS Pillar 2?
Look, I've been doing a big project in this, and Ian and I have been both in the US and the UK together recently. Where I've sort of landed is Pillar 2 is the solution looking for a problem. We've started with a series of technologies that we want to get after, rather than starting with the three countries sitting down and go, what are the common military capability problems we have, and what are the key technologies that we can apply to get after them? So it's kind of been back to front. Now, add into the fact that it took 3 years for the three countries to decide that AUKUS Pillar 2 wasn't going to get a separate budget line item, that they had to come out of programs of record, and you go, or the IIP in our case, you go and look at the programs of record in the IIP in all three countries, and they're all struggling for money to deliver on the capability they've currently got in them. So then you're going to ask capability managers to find spare money to spend on Pillar 2. I mean, the other thing it's bleedingly obvious, I think, now is why aren't we Pillar 2ing Pillar 1? Why aren't we taking advanced capabilities? And we heard this from Mike Gallagher just before. Why aren't we applying advanced manufacturing techniques, AI and other technologies to improve shipbuilding outcomes in the United Kingdom and the United States to help get after that shipbuilding problem? And of course, it was really great to hear, as the South Australian Premier said, the opportunities in Australia is we've got a greenfield site in Adelaide. We can bake that in. I mean, you're talking about shipyards in Barrow and Furness that are building ships, you know, for a couple of 100 years in the United Kingdom, and shipyards in the UK that have been building submarines since the 1940s and 50s. They're old shipyards. Someone described to me in the US that those shipyards look like steampunk versions of shipbuilding rather than modern manufacturing capabilities. So I think the key question for Pillar 2 is actually, what are the problems that the three countries have in common? And how can we get after them using technology? And where's the money coming from to do that? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean buckets of new money, but the countries have to carve out specific money in their budgets to apply to that, to get after the problems that we commonly share, rather than starting with the technology first and try and retrofitting it.
Yeah. Dennis, the Taiwan question seems to lie at the heart of the review, whether or not Australia would support the US in a conflict with China over Taiwan, and use our Virginia-class submarines in a conflict like that. Do you think that the government needs to be more explicit on this particular point, and
a particular point of
our support or lack of support for the US if it came to blows on Taiwan?
Well, I don't know quite what more the government could do. I think those who want to see the Prime Minister say publicly that China constitutes a threat to Australia, I think are simply wanting to do so for their own purposes, rather than encourage the Prime Minister to do anything that would marvellously be in the national interest. Every government I've worked for has always been careful in what it says publicly, and I don't think this government is really any different in that respect. If there was something between China and the US over Taiwan, as others have said today, we would be involved. Whether it be Pine Gap, whether it be the disbursement of US forces, we would be involved, and I think that's known. I just want to make one point. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the size of the defence budget. Now, I don't think it matters a damn whether you talk in terms of a percentage of GDP or whether you talk in terms of capability needs. It was this government that after the 2022 election that commissioned the Defence Strategic Review. It was this government that accepted the recommendations of the Defence Strategic Review. If you look at the capabilities embedded in the Defence Strategic Review, and if you're going to fund those capabilities, it's going to take you north of 3% of GDP, whatever way you cut it. So I think the debate is really a bit of a nonsense in its own way. I think next year's national defence strategy, I think, will be fundamental in establishing just how serious the body politic is in respect of defence. I think so far so good. I understand where the government is at, and I think by and large the government has done a pretty good job. But there's a big challenge ahead of it, and next year's National Defence Strategy is going to tell us a lot.
I'll come back to Kath in one moment on some of those forward items, but Peter, Dean, you were a significant co-author in the DSR. Do you find it a little bit strange that Richard Marles now saying, well, hey, we'll spend more money, but we need to identify what the capabilities are first?
Well, I think what the Deputy Prime Minister did is also identify, and what his government is planning on doing is prioritising what those things are. Strategy is about making choices. Prioritisation is key. Ambitions are limitless and resources are finite. That's the reality of the world that we live in. I mean, I'm really encouraged that the government has actually pushed this notion of we're going to look at capabilities and we're going to fund those capabilities. Way back, if we remember the Abbott government era, we had another debate in 2012, 2013 about GDP spending on defence. It warps the debate if that's what you hang the debate on. I do agree with Dennis's broad perspective, but the key thing is, what are they going to spend their money on? What are they going to prioritise in that national defence strategy, and how quickly are they going to get after it? I think the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister and the government's on the right track. We'll wait and see what that looks like. But if we get fixated on a number, then we lose sight of that, and it's not actually good for a public debate. I mean, if the public get to the sense that a magic number of defence spending will make us safe, that's just simply not true. I mean, we saw Mike Gallagher say this just before. You can spend less money, but if you're spending the money better, then you get greater efficiency gains out of it. And I think that the other good thing about the government and what Richard Marles indicated today, his clear focus is going to be on an internal reform process inside defence to maximise the organisation and function of it, and one would assume that the money is spent as efficiently as it can be before just adding more money. But there are clear areas of capability that have been identified where there needs to be investment.
Spend hours unpacking that, I think. Kath, infrastructure will be a key driver of AUKUS, and we have a lot to do on that front. There's a lot to be done in the West, including a dry dock if we want to be serious about submarine maintenance, an East Coast submarine base. We will need a high-level nuclear waste facility. how do you see the progress? And again, do we have the right human building blocks for that as well?
Well, I think the first starting point here, before we get to the conversation about infrastructure, it's about actually understanding where is our engineering talent today, yeah? So the whole of the public sector employs about 15% of the engineering talent in this country. 85%, you'll find it in mining, big infrastructure, big construction, you find it in healthcare, of course, you find it in hospitality, you find it in advanced manufacturing, in processing, in petrochemicals. It's everywhere, right? So to get after infrastructure or anything to begin with, we need to stop the war for engineering talent. Now, we have lived with this for nearly 35 years, right? 30% of all of our partners are saying they are critically short of engineers. 60%, right, are saying that they have key shortages. And that is holding the productivity of this nation back. We don't have enough supply.
Is it a problem of homegrown
Absolutely,
engineers? Or...
Absolutely, because of course, remember Engineers Australia, credentials
Yep.
all through our skilled migrant program, and 60% of all engineers in this country are born overseas. So we have to grow our way out of it by tackling the issue of supply, and then we can unlock the people to deliver the infrastructure. But we can't talk about technology without talking about the people who can animate it. And really that's the thing that Engineers Australia is so focused on, and we will work with everyone, governments of all persuasions, we will work with all sectors to unlock supply of engineers because our nation needs them. They solve complex problems.
It's going to be another huge ongoing discussion. I can see some red on the clock down there, so we better keep moving, but can I thank all our panellists? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter Dean, Catherine Richards, Ian Langford, Dennis Richardson, and of course Ben. Moving on to our next speaker for this afternoon, please welcome to the stage former Treasurer, former Ambassador to the United States of America, and many more things, Joe Hockey, for a Q&A with me. I feel like there's another friend who should be joining us.
Yes.
I'll sit next to you, because otherwise it would be weird.
It's great to be back in the Great Hall. Hasn't changed much.
It's so beautiful. I think that's the point.
Yeah.
That beautiful tapestry behind us, it always makes me feel nostalgic. It's really lovely. Do you miss your days in politics?
No.
And you want to elaborate on that?
The last time I spoke here was after my last budget. There was a bigger crowd, not as affectionate though.
Right,
Yeah.
well. You've done a lot of exciting things since then, and of course one of those was spending 4 years as our ambassador to the United States, where among other achievements you got the grass tennis courts at the Australian Embassy renovated so that you could play tennis and other ball sports with the rich and powerful. You were Donald Trump's golfing buddy. So with that expertise in mind and all your other expertise, how would you handle, if you were Anthony Albanese, his first face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump on Wednesday? What would be your opening gambit?
I'd walk in and say, Mr. President, you've got a war in Ukraine to deal with, you've got a war in the Middle East to deal with, you're trying to restructure the biggest economy in the world, you've had a terrible political assassinations in Minnesota. Everyone that meets you asks for something. I'm here to say, what can I do to help?
And what would that be?
Well, I'll tell you what it would be. I mean, we can get down to tin tacks, but everyone that goes into the Oval Office goes asking for something. Go in there to Donald Trump, disarm him and say, what can I do to help? Because we're aligned in our interests. We want freedom. We want democracy. We want a safe world. What can we do to help? And that would, Donald Trump, it will be first impressions. Donald Trump is very focused on sizing you up immediately, working out whether you are on his side or the other side. And I'd be a little disarming in that sense to do that.
Okay, so then I'll be Donald Trump in this scenario. I say what we want is you to spend 3.5% of your GDP on defence from today, and I also want unfettered access for American beef into Australian markets.
And I'd say, well, Mr. President, let's start with the first one. We are increasing our defence spending, but arguably it's not enough. But we are a partner that you've had for more than 100 years. You know that, Mr. President. We're the only country in the world that has been side by side with the United States in every major conflict since 1918. No one else has been there. We want to do it again. The biggest issue for us is about having deterrence with submarines. And the deal that was done is a deal that, you know, and I know Donald Trump doesn't have regard for deals held by previous presidents. He doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about alliances like that. But I would say to him, Mr. President, what I'm saying now is you're having trouble building enough submarines to meet the challenges of the future. We want to help. We are immediately going to send 500 young people from South Australia to work with Huntington Ingalls, with Electric Boat, to learn the skills. We are going to help you with your maintenance program by bringing Virginias to Australia. We're going to start by being part of the supply chain, not just on critical minerals. We will help build the Virginias for you in Australia, in South Australia. So why not start now? Why are we waiting for the AUKUS subs? Start now in South Australia, building various components of the Virginias and the Columbus. An Australian-owned company, Austal, is already in Alabama building the command centres for the Virginias and Columbus class submarines. Australian-owned company in Alabama is doing it. And why aren't we walking into the meeting and saying, we're not only giving you a cheque for $3 billion, we're actually on the ground in Alabama helping you to build your submarines now?
Okay, so then I'm still Donald Trump. Yep. I say, but aren't you...
I haven't got to beef yet.
Oh, yeah, I'm not going to let you off the hook on that.
You've got great beef, Mr. President. We'd love to welcome him to Australia.
And he says, OK, well, stop asking annoying questions about the beef. Just accept it the way it is.
Well, I mean, on beef, it's about tracking from birth to butcher. And the problem is the US doesn't have a national licensing system the same way we do. It's very addressable. There are other things like new coal is a very low-hanging fruit that is very addressable. There are certain things. He is transactional, Donald Trump. He wants to be able to walk out of there and say, I've got a deal. These are the 1, 2, 3 things I've given. These are the 1, 2, 3 things that we're going to give. But he wouldn't talk about what he's giving, but he'd do that.
You were sitting at my table and I heard you nodding and murmuring in approval when Jennifer Parker said that Trump is not unpredictable. He might be...
He's entirely predictable. I don't know what people don't... Maybe I'm too close to it. But, I mean, I lived more than half my life in Washington and I'm still very engaged with the Oval Office and so on. And I think the President is very predictable. He is the most open and transparent president, political leader I've ever seen. I mean, you know, and you cringe because he is so open and transparent. I mean, you know, taking a Qatari plane, usually they wait until they're finished as president. You don't see Barack Obama or you see Bill Clinton occasionally on commercial planes. They're all got private jets provided by donors after they leave. Donald Trump said, no, give it to me now. So,
okay.
You know, it's like... I mean, you know, he's always been like that. He's very...
Okay, so I'm going to...
I won't tell you all the stories.
Oh, no, go on. Tell me one.
I need to have a few drinks.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll do that later. Okay, so I'm going to say, yes, you can build a Virginia-class submarine starting now. So do you have any major defence manufacturers in Australia who can actually do this job?
Of course, Austal. And it's subject to a takeover by our friends at Hanwha, which is ridiculous. We have one Australian prime. We have one chance at this. One chance, and it's Austal. And I mean, Austal's government relations have been hopeless, right? But the fundamental point is they've got a $12 billion book in the United States building $12 billion of naval ships for the US Navy. In Australia, they got virtually zero. And it's an Australian listed company. So when Austal goes, we've gone. So in the United States, for every dollar they spend on procurement, probably 80 cents in the dollar is with American companies. In the UK, probably 80 cents in the dollar of every dollar spent on procurement in the UK is with UK companies. We are probably today 20 cents in the dollar. And if Austal goes to foreign ownership, it'll be, 5 cents in the dollar. You wonder, Chris Hillman asked a great question before, how do you carry the Australian people with you? Why aren't we investing in our own businesses, in our own technology? I do that. My firm does that. I set up Australia's first national security investment fund. I have millions of dollars of my own money earned post-politics. Millions of dollars invested in Australian companies trying to get ahead. Fleet Space, With You, With Me, Whiskey Project, Speed 3D. But they cannot get ahead in Australia alone. The reason why super funds and others don't invest in Australia is because you are investing in companies that have one client, which is the Australian government, which is an unreliable client under the coalition or Labor. So you can only invest in companies that expand beyond our borders. So we need, if we're going to have any Australian companies do this, we need them to be expansionary, like Austal, where it couldn't get an Australian contract, but it's the third biggest naval shipbuilder in the United States. And if we just let it go into foreign hands, how do we have a defence industry that supports us in conflict? I mean, look at Ukraine. Their drones are indigenous. Look at Israel with its technology from pages right through to a range of other things. It is indigenous. And so the problem, my great fear, and it was touched on, but no one's being explicit about it, how do we use Australian technology in order to build our national security? Because only then can we get super funds and investors to go into it. So when I set up my fund, 1941 fund, in partnership with Ellison Capital, I went around all the high net worth individuals I knew in the US, Australia, the UK. A number of them said, well, Joe, why would we invest in defence? You're relying on a government contract, one contract. I said, yeah, but we're going dual purpose, we're going private and public investment, but this is our future technology. And gradually I've been educating the investment class. The combined assets of my investors would be about $60 billion, but we've been only able to deploy, tens of millions of dollars here in Australia. We've started investing in companies in the US that invest in Australia.
So as the Donald Trump expert, I'm going to go back to being me now because I can't maintain this illusion for any longer. Do you think this review of AUKUS is going to make any difference? Is this just a box-ticking exercise?
No. I mean, there's an ulterior motive. And the message, so therefore, the ulterior motive is in the United States, there is great anxiety about the fact they're not producing enough Virginia-class submarines. So our solution isn't to say, okay, we're going to take them off you. Our solution has to be, actually, we're going to help you build them. We'll send, as I said, 500 people from Adelaide over there, and then we will build, we'll build command modules, we'll build torpedoes in Adelaide, we'll build some for the Virginia. I'm not saying give up on the AUKUS, but let's get into that. Don't just say, oh, we're going to send you these critical minerals and rare earths and you can do it all. They've got blockages. And I've been to Barrow and I've been to Newport. I go to these places. I was with a range of senators and congressmen 3 weeks ago in the US, and I go back on Thursday. And they're all saying the same thing. How are we going to do it, Joe? I say, okay, here's our solution. We've got E3 visas. We can bring people over. You train them. We'll set up a maintenance facility in South Australia and Henderson, and we will deliver. We will help you to reach your goals so that we both win.
Okay, well, there are drinks afterwards. I'm here. Joe is staying for the drinks. You can buy him a drink and get him to tell you one of your his great stories. Joe Hockey, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Now moving right along to our fifth panel for the day. Please welcome Stephen Mulligan MP, Treasurer, Minister for Defence and Space Industries, Minister for Police and Member for Lee in the South Australian Government, and Dean Michie, Corporate General Manager of Hanwha Defence Australia, for an In Conversation with our own Ben Packham.
Test. Well, probably just jump right into it. Stephen Mulligan, you heard Joe Hockey there. What's stopping South Australia building components for Virginia-class submarines now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to hear some of the views that have been put forward, not just by the other members of the excellent panels that we've had today, but some of the constant testing that we're getting about how we're running down not just the delivery of what we know we've got before us, but what some of the broader economic opportunities are. And I think it highlights the extraordinary opportunity that our nation has now, not just in terms of delivering the defence platforms and systems, but the economic opportunity to do as much of the work as possible here in Australia. And you heard from our Premier today, we are trying to lean into that opportunity as much as possible from a South Australian perspective. And I think we're seeing companies which are not only expanding their footprints in South Australia to meet that challenge, but we're now getting other companies that are coming to our country, including coming to South Australia, setting up manufacturing operations for the first time. Not just to supply the Australian government, but to build a base for export back to other markets elsewhere. And I think that's a really positive development for our country as well as for the states that it's happening in.
Is there a missing ingredient, though? Is there anything that you need to see from the federal government to kickstart this kind of activity now rather than down the track?
Well, I actually think some of the responsibility falls back to the subnational governments. It falls back to the state and territories. And we're trying to meet some of that challenge, and it's mainly about supplying the labour, making sure that we've got the adequately skilled workforce that can step into the roles that will take on the responsibility for delivering. And we are trying to pull every single lever in South Australia, all throughout our education system, and then getting into the workforce to help the companies make sure that they can deliver on the platforms and the programs that the Commonwealth is engaging them for. And that's probably the most significant and intimidating challenge that we have, and it's the reason why you hear, again, our Premier, but other commentators nationally say, this isn't just a Western Australian or a South Australian task, this is a national task. Every shoulder needs to be pushing against this will to make sure we succeed.
Dean Michie, I probably should also ask you about something that Hockey said about Hanwha, about its proposed takeover of Austal. What's the value proposition for Australia in that? But I'd also like to ask you about the investment climate for Hanwha. Hanwha's been on the receiving end of some pretty savage defence cuts in terms of the self-propelled howitzers and the infantry fighting vehicles. So is Australia investing enough?
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah. So two-part question.
I think it's three parts.
Three parts.
But I'll start by addressing, firstly, Hanwha's investment in Australia. It's a partnership. So with what we've seen with Hanwha in Geelong and the HACE, the Armoured Vehicle Centre of Excellence, there's a company here in Australia that now has 450 people. 15 of those are from South Korea. Everybody else is Australian, and that's Australian engineers. With our delivery of the Redback infantry fighting vehicle, there's a mandated Australian industry component of that. So more than 50% of all of the work is going to go to Australian subcontractors. So I would make it clear that Hanwha, with its investment in Australia, it is a partnership. It shouldn't be seen from my mind as a takeover. To address, I guess, essentially the part about the cuts that we received from the DSR, we now have 45 self-propelled howitzers or reloading vehicles to deliver, and we have 129 infantry fighting vehicles. It's not a lot, but we think it's enough for Hanwha Defence Australia to show what Korean industry and Australian workers can do together and actually prove ourselves to not just Australia, but to other parts of the world that what those capabilities of Hanwha are. Because Hanwha isn't just armoured vehicles, they can essentially supply all of the pillars of military capability, and they do so back in Korea. I guess final question, are we spending enough? I'm a defence executive. The answer is always going to be, of course, we want more. We don't get to make those decisions. Elected officials get to make those decisions, and I think that's probably a good thing.
A question for both of you. One of the big complaints from defence industry, and it's springboarding off what you've just said, Dean, is that there is a lack of certainty at the moment in terms of projects going ahead in the current funding environment. What's the outlook at the moment for defence industry, and how is that affecting its own investment behaviour?
I would say, talking to people from, I guess, the SME community, they are starting to feel the pinch at the moment. So if there were funds to be released, that part of industry would love to see them released as soon as possible and to see decisions made. We're not looking to change what's in the DSR or anything like that, but if there's something on the table, let's keep it moving and keep the industry pushing along.
What are the employers in your state telling you, Stephen?
Well, I think it's a mixed perspective, because we obviously know the task we've got in front of us with naval shipbuilding, both for the work that's underway with the frigates and also coming up towards the submarine program. And elsewhere, there is significant money already being rolled out, which there's a huge amount of effort going towards meeting that challenge. But I do appreciate that there are some procurements which industry would like to see sooner. But I do have to say, I sympathise with Joe as a state treasurer. He was a federal treasurer. People always want more, and they always want it sooner. And we are in a very, very fast-moving, very complex strategic environment, as we've heard today. And we've heard from the Commonwealth Government that they are doing as much as possible, as quickly as possible, to make sure that their procurements are as up-to-date and fit for purpose. So I think within the constraints that provides, we are seeing a significant amount of work getting out to industry. But of course, there will always be some parts of industry that are in receipt of delays in procurements, or procurements that have not advanced as quickly as what they'd like to see. And so, to some extent, you'll continue hearing those calls. Whether it's now, whether it's 5 years ago, or whether it's 5 or 10 years into the future, there'll always be an element of that. The task for government is to try and close the gap as much as possible, trying to expedite decisions as quickly as possible, get that money out into the companies so that they can deliver this stuff as quickly as possible. But I do think we've got to be fair and recognise the incredibly complex and challenging environment that the Commonwealth is working within at the moment.
Gentlemen, we've been a little bit squeezed for time, so we'll have to wind it up there. But thank you very much for participating in Defending Australia.
Thanks so much, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen Mulligan, Ben Hudson and Ben Packham. That brings us to our last segment for the day. Please welcome to the stage Admiral David Johnson, AC, RAN, Chief of the Defence Force, for a Q&A with our own Chris Uhlmann.
Colleagues, good afternoon. While Chris isn't on the stage, I've got the opportunity to make some comments, so I'll hold him off for a brief moment. But I recognise I'm the last speaker of the day. You have had many distinguished speakers and well-informed talking to you throughout the day. I am keen to add my own thoughts, and I know Chris will do a question and answer session briefly before your networking event. First, my thanks to the Australian for the opportunity to be with you. Defence is an important issue, and this is an important opportunity for voices to be heard and views to be shared and information and insight to be gained. And I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians and Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. As the Deputy Prime Minister who was with you earlier and others have reiterated, we are living in a challenging world. The international security system is being aggressively pushed and pulled between different visions of how it ought to be, and we are observing that contest in every region. In the Middle East, the recent strikes between Israel and Iran represent a deeply concerning escalation. The risk of further regional instability is severe, particularly recognising ongoing volatility across the Middle East region in Gaza, Syria and Yemen. I reiterate the Minister's comments urging all states to exercise restraint and pursue a diplomatic resolution. I can confirm that all Australian Defence Force personnel assigned to the region are safe, and Defence will continue to observe events closely to provide for their protection. In Europe, we have witnessed immense change since Russia invaded Ukraine, with clear parallels and links to our own region. Left unchecked, Russia's invasion risks a precedent for similar attempted annexations. Ukraine's innovative use of modern capability to present novel asymmetric challenges have lessons for states seeking to defend themselves from a more powerful adversary. North Korean soldiers have directly supported the Russian war effort. China has provided dual-use technology and equipment. These are more than relationships of convenience and directly affect our own regional security architecture. In the Indo-Pacific, there are many challenges requiring prudent statecraft. Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, India and Pakistan, and competing maritime claims in the South China Sea. Earlier this year, a Chinese maritime task group circumnavigated Australia. Defence used multiple methods to extensively monitor that task group, and the ADF shadowed the task group during its entire passage near our country. Our response was proportionate to the situation and reflected our role to safeguard our national interests. Concurrently, Defence maintained other routine operations comfortably within the capacity of the force. As an expanding blue water navy, we should expect the Chinese Navy to undertake similar deployments more regularly to the Southwest Pacific and Indian Ocean. These deployments are opportunities to expand their training, improve their operational readiness, and demonstrate their increasing capability. The Deputy Prime Minister recently highlighted at the Shangri-La Dialogue just last month the shifting balance of power in our region and pointed to the importance of reassurance and transparency. In that regard, Australia's approach is clear. Our National Defence Strategy is publicly available, specifies our capability priorities, and describes our national approach to deterrence. Defence's primary capability priority is the nuclear-powered submarines. I acknowledge that the United States is reviewing the terms of AUKUS as the United Kingdom did last year and as Australia has done. Those previous reviews were positive in their appraisal, highlighting that AUKUS benefits all three partners by enabling our respective industrial bases and workforces to manufacture and sustain shared capability, by removing regulatory barriers to capability development and increasing our combined capacity for integrated deterrence. Additional to AUKUS, Defence's immediate capability priorities include long-range strike, disruptive technology, resilient infrastructure in Northern Australia, and enhancing our international partnerships. I would like to discuss these briefly with you today and highlight the progress Defence has made to ensure the ADF can achieve a range of effects that constitute proportional and capable responses to various scenarios. Defence has rapidly developed the ability to project force. Within a 6-month period last year, Navy successfully fired the Advanced Anti-Ship Naval Strike Missile, the Standard Missile 6, capable of ballistic missile defence, and the Tomahawk land strike missile. These capabilities contribute to a significantly more lethal Navy, able to strike at range to protect and deter. Defence has also accelerated the acquisition of the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, known as HIMARS, for Army. When equipped with the precision strike missile, the HIMARS will be able to strike targets at a range of 500 kilometres. Air Force is also increasing its lethality, bringing into service the long-range anti-ship missile and joint strike missile, the latter of which Kongsberg will manufacture here in Newcastle. Supporting Defence's ability to strike at range are improved intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance systems, which enable the ADF to accurately track and engage targets across our theatre and are constantly improving. The defence industrial sector, which I know you have spoken to today, has an important role around innovation. The Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator, ASCA, is engaging industry partners to rapidly develop and deliver priority asymmetric technology to the warfare. Current examples include Mission Blackthorn, which is developing technology to degrade integrated air and missile defence systems. Mission Syracuse, which will pursue means to counter the threat that small drones present to defence members operating in vulnerable environments. And Mission Talon Strike, which will seek medium-range precision loitering munition capable of locating, tracking and engaging targets. We have certainly seen in Ukraine, but also other conflicts over the last decade, the effects these technologies can generate and how quickly counter-technology is developed. These are critical areas of rapid change, and Defence needs to be clear in how we navigate both the threats and opportunities. As I've raised in previous remarks this month, we have to consider how Northern Australia might support combat operations. I recognise that this is a different way of conceptualising where and how the ADF operates. There are many inputs to sustain operations, including resilient infrastructure, fuel reserves, medical stores, the efficacy of supply chains and our domestic industry manufacturing and sustainment base. Defence is working closely with partners across government, industry and the private sector to understand what we need to have in place to support operations from Australia. We are also working with international partners to improve interoperability and operational readiness, such as force protection and posture initiatives with the United States in the top end. That brings me to my final point. It has been a fundamental part of Australian defence planning for decades to cooperate with international partners to address shared security challenges, and we will continue to do so to support the security and stability of the Indo-Pacific. Our ongoing schedule of international operations, activities and exercises with partners is extensive. The ADF routinely works alongside the United States, United Kingdom, Indonesia, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, India, France and many others. We also have incredibly close relationships with our partners in the South Pacific, including Papua New Guinea, Fiji and New Zealand. Next month, we will all see these partners and others cooperating at exercise Talisman Sabre, Australia's largest warfighting exercise. Talisman Sabre demonstrates our commitment to pursuing a multilateral approach to regional stability and security. This year, more than 30,000 personnel from 19 countries will participate in the exercise. The exercise will include scenarios across all 5 combat domains and test our real-world ability to logistically support major operations. I acknowledge that other countries that are not participating will be keen to observe the exercise, and we expect to have visitors again this year. But I would like to reiterate that this is a cooperative exercise intending to enhance our collective ability to respond to a range of crises in the Indo-Pacific, not targeting any specific contingency. We seek to support a stable and secure order in the Indo-Pacific, where sovereignty is recognised and disputes are resolved through dialogue and in accordance with international law. Defence is continuing to work towards the objectives outlined in the National Defence Strategy, bringing new capability into service rapidly, improving resilience and cooperating with our international partners. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Admiral, thank you very much. There should be a microphone there, someone.
I've got one.
Ah, great, excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Admiral. I just want to take you back to something you said about a week or so ago. You were at an Australian Strategic Policy Institute conference, and you said that Australians had to get their head around the idea that we might have to launch combat operations from our homeland for the first time since the Second World War. Could you elaborate a bit on that for us, please? Under what contingency do you see that?
Chris, it's a reflection as much about the change in technologies and the strategic environment in our region. So one of the most important changes has been the access and availability of long-range weapons, whether used from ships, aircraft, or from land environments. It means that our ability to have force projected against our national interests can occur at long range, and consequently we need to be able to do similarly by holding forces at risk in order to achieve that deterrence. That may need to have to be performed from our homeland, and why the infrastructure enhancement in Northern Australia is so important, so that we've got the ability to use our geography both for dispersal and resilience, but also to be able to mount those operations from.
We're seeing at the moment, of course, Israel defending itself from missiles, and obviously they have a lot less warning than we would have. But are we in any position at all to be able to defend ourselves from those missiles?
Yes. We have a range both on our ship platforms, a very capable 5th generation Air Force, the introduction of very new surface-to-air or missile capabilities in the Army for land-based air defence. We absolutely have capabilities both to project the force, but as importantly, to protect ourselves in that environment.
I guess what we're seeing at the moment is a sustained assault on a place like Israel, though. So, you know, we might have a certain amount of missile defence, but could you sustain it?
It depends, of course. Our circumstances, Chris, are not what Israel's circumstance. And geography is different from us. I think the distance between Tehran to Tel Aviv is around 1,600 kilometres. Of course, you draw that kind of circle around Australia and you're dealing with a very different set of circumstances. So for us, it's about having the right capabilities in the scenarios that we may find ourselves. And as the defence strategy has said, we do need to uplift our capacity and why the ability to both manufacture weapons in Australia and explosive ordnance is so important, and for some of those high-end capabilities that we are able to purchase them and bring them into inventory.
You spoke about the Chinese warships, and one of the things that they demonstrated to us was China's ability to project power and to keep a ship at sea and ships at sea for a very long period of time. You know, it's not just the military action. They're sending us a message. What message do you think that the Chinese Navy was trying to send us?
I think China is growing quicker than we have seen since the Second World War in its military capabilities across both conventional forces and the Public Liberation Army Navy is an example of that, and the task groups that we saw a consequence, and equally in their nuclear capabilities. So that breadth of growth in Chinese capability is significant right across their force. As they grow, we're expecting that they will seek to be able to demonstrate that capability and exert the influence that they believe is in their national interests. So the task group presence in our waters is a reflection of that increased capacity in the Chinese fleet. They have operated intensively in the first island chain. We have been expecting that they would be moved beyond that, and the task group's presence in our waters is a demonstration of that capacity.
And you think we'll see them again?
Yes.
In the near future?
We watch them closely. They have had a pattern for many years of presence, particularly with movements into the Middle East region, where they conduct task group counter-piracy operations. We do expect that they will be in the Indian Ocean, in the Southwest Pacific at a more regular rate than we have seen.
And of course they have a right in international waters to conduct their affairs, but one would expect that they would let us know if they were doing live fire exercises off our east coast, which they did not do. And the other thing would be, if you were doing the same thing in the South China Sea, what would be your expectation if a Chinese ship showed up in the South China Sea and started conducting unannounced live fire exercises? How would the Chinese respond to something like that?
So I think we are a very professional Australian Defence Force with a very professional Navy capability. We're very clear on what does professional maritime behaviour look like, and avoiding disturbing civil air lanes or civil maritime traffic is not that type of professional behaviour that we see. We manage ourselves in a way that when we do firings, we're very clear on the area, the nature of warnings that are provided in order to achieve our objectives without causing disruption when we're doing so.
You also spoke of the Ukraine war, and obviously we've seen an advancement of warfare there. I've been to Ukraine, I have been to the front line. The advancement that you can see is drones, and the way that that is changing on an almost weekly basis. Now, do we send anyone to the front to observe that kind of change? Are we learning lessons from what's happening in Ukraine?
Chris, we, like I think every military force, is observing very closely the application of technology. I think I've made comment previously, the cycle that we are hearing from the Ukrainian military is the technology rate is about a 12-week cycle of innovation and then a counter being put in place to that innovation. Drones are a very good example of how quickly that has evolved from drones being controlled by radio frequency, which is able to be disrupted, to drones being controlled by optical fibre. So the cycle is very quick. We are watching all of the way targeting is performed, the very asymmetric operations that we've observed with uncrewed maritime vessels in the Black Sea. All of them have relevance to us, but all need to be translated into our circumstance. So I use distance as an example. The distance from Kiev to Moscow is 750 kilometres. The area where intense drone warfare is occurring is about 30 kilometres around the land border. We've just got to make sure we learn the right lessons from what we're observing.
One of them, as you mentioned, is the naval drones, and in fact, using those naval drones, Ukraine has managed to sink 1/3 of Russia's Black Sea fleet. These are extraordinarily expensive ships that are going down. So are we going to get the kind of capability that can do that asymmetric warfare that you're talking about?
So the uncrewed systems across all three of our domains, both those on the sea, in the air and on the land, all critical to us. We have a number of innovation strategies around them. Ghost Shark is well known. It is one of a multiple set just in the maritime domain of uncrewed systems that have a range of different employment options available to them. So the short answer is yes.
Everyone's spoken today about defending our sea lanes, the need to get supplies to us. Fuel is the obvious thing. If our sea lanes were cut off, a lot of our fuel comes through the South China Sea. We have 2 weeks' worth of supply. Are you confident that we have the capability to be able to maintain those supplies into Australia in a conflict that Australia might not be directly involved in?
Of course, it depends on the nature of the conflict, Chris. That's a very broad question, but the importance of sea lanes is critical to us. not just that which travels on the sea, but 99% of our internet traffic goes through sea cables. So the maritime environment and its critical nature to our national prosperity and economy is a fundamental focus and priority for us.
What about those sea cables? Because we've seen that has been a recent thing as well, the dragging of anchors, but beyond that, the deliberate target, well, that was deliberate targeting, obviously, but that is now a very active area of countries interfering with each other.
It is a very active area of how warfare or disruption or maybe called grey zone activities are conducted, and it has our attention.
And in the grey zone, obviously, we're seeing an enormous amount of activity, which is the attacks that we see on a daily basis on our businesses and on government sites. But there is also another development, which is called volatile, which is the placing of virtual bombs on our critical infrastructure. Now, if you did that on a bridge in Sydney, that would be considered an act of war. That is already taking place inside our borders, isn't it?
But that's a good question for other colleagues than me, Chris. But
it's
a neat try, thank you. But your point is a true one, though, and why even in defence we have cyber as the fifth operating domain. In many respects, the two newest domains, cyber and space, are where active conflict is occurring, if you use that term now, to be able to put pressure on states or to test and probe. It's very much a part of our view of how do we defend ourselves, but also what opportunity those operating domains provide to us.
Finally, if there is a paragraph 1 in having a federal government, it is the defence of Australia is the reason that we essentially set up the federal government in Australia. The buck essentially stops with you. Are you certain that you have the money that you need and that the Defence Force, its bureaucracy and its fighting force are fit for purpose right now if push comes to shove?
I know you've had this question during the day, and I've similarly spoken to it recently. Perhaps a few observations. The defence budget has been spent within 1% of its allocation over the last 7 years. So we are expending our budget. We have a mechanism to continue to review the intelligence about the threats that we may face, consider the strategies that we may employ to address them, and to go back to the government in that biennial, every 2-year cycle, to re-raise what risks we think the country may have to contend with, our ability then to provide options on how we can close those risks down. That's a mechanism that I welcome in order to be able to make sure the government has a clear view of what we're thinking and what we think we need.
Well, Admiral David Johnson, you would know as a Navy man that we are standing between these people and drinks, and you wouldn't want to do that if you're on board a ship. And can I say it's a quaint American thing, but as the son of a soldier, thank you for your service. And all of us, obviously, it's in our best interest to wish you well in the future and hope that all of the things that Australia plans come to fruition. So can you please thank the Chief of Defence?
Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Johnston, and thank you, Chris. Well, I think we have all earned a drink, so please join us at the back of the room. You can ask some difficult questions, have the big conversations. Thank you so much for joining us again at Defending Australia. Thank you to Gemma Jones, to Michelle Gunn, and to everybody from News Corp Australia who's made it possible. Please join us. Thank you very much.